Let's talk about visual elements. Start with line, shape, and mass. So line, when we're defining line, a line is a point traveling over a distance. Line can be used in a multitude of structural and expressive ways. The examples that we have on the screen here are from the Japanese woodblock print tradition. They depend heavily on the feelings that are evoked by line. The sort of mood, the sort of rhythm, the sort of feelings of the line are the real energy of these pieces. The sort of flowing rhythms of the curved lines on the left, and the angular, jagged, sort of asymmetrical patterns of the angular lines on the right. Some artworks use line in a very impulsive, expressive, textural kind of a way. When you're describing the use of formal elements like these, you end up leaning a lot on adjectives and a sort of impression that they create in the way that they're used. Interesting thing about photography. What one of the great things that photography does is it takes a view of a world that is filled with space and three-dimensional objects and movement, light and shadow, and turns it into a composition of shapes and lines and lights and darks. So this photograph by Lee Friedlander is of a city scene that if you were to look at that scene in real life, if you just happen to be passing by there, it probably would not look very interesting in real life. This just looks like a space in between a couple of buildings with a bunch of wires and poles and lights and just stuff around. It doesn't look very interesting at all if you were to see it in real life. But you look at it in a photograph, and he's angled the photograph, angled his camera, he set things up in his viewfinder in such a way that it turns into a composition that's really interesting. That has a balance of diagonals and a balance of the way that one line leads you to another line that leads you to another line, the way that the angles and planes and lights and darks work together. It becomes an almost abstract kind of a composition. What's interesting to look at comes from the compositional elements, their shapes and the lines and the texture, much more so than any feeling that you might have about the place itself. So it's possible for artworks to include either actual lines or implied lines, or combinations of the two of them. And that has to do with that gestalt effect of how your perception will group together things that are aligned with each other in really clear ways. You can also find implied shapes. If things that are grouped together will sort of suggest a shape that unifies them. In the bottom right-hand section of this slide, you'll see examples of geometric and organic shapes. Geometric shapes are shapes that have clear, distinct edges that are regular shapes. Irregular shapes that are maybe softer or more sort of unpredictable, sort of natural-looking shapes. We call those organic shapes. Let's look at some examples in a painting. So this is Salvador Dali's The Persistence of Memory, and in this painting you can see both geometric and organic shapes. Here you can see geometric shapes in the form of the sort of rectangular platform on the left-hand side. You can see another geometric shape up here in this sort of platform. Now the watches, okay, now here's one watch that has a distinctly geometric shape, but there are other watches that have become organic. They sort of melted and become floppy, and that's the whole uncanniness of surrealism right there, because the watch isn't, I mean, in real life, a watch can't be floppy and still work, okay? So we're clearly not in the realm of regular everyday human life here. The use of shapes contributes to the strange alien feeling that you get in Dali's painting. Now, mass is what we're describing when we're talking about the three-dimensional qualities of sculpture and the way that they occupy space and project a feeling of weight. On the left-hand side, this is an Egyptian sculpture that we could describe as having a heavy, enclosed kind of mass. And on the right, this wire sculpture by Calder has more of a light and open kind of mass. Let's move on to the illusion of depth. So there are a few different elements that we need to look at that contribute to the illusion of depth in an artwork, including shading, overlapping, atmospheric perspective, and linear perspective. Here you can see how the use of light and shadow creates an illusion of mass, that in itself gives a sense of depth to this illustration. Now let's look at these diagrams for a second and see how overlapping and placement in themselves can contribute to a sense of space. Any one of these tricks in themselves may not be enough to give a sense of depth that is convincing, but when they're used in combination, they contribute to a greater and greater sense of depth. It becomes more convincing the more of it, the more of the elements that are put together. So in the top left, you see just overlapping, so that such that the circle on the right seems like it's further away from us than the circle that's on the left. And that's also true in the picture in the top right. The larger of the circles on the left looks like it's closer to us, and the circle that's all the way on the right, it's both overlapped by the other circle and it's smaller, so it has more of a sense of being further away from us. Vertical placement is another trick that has been used to suggest depth in different traditions and times, and that's an interesting trick. And if you put all three of those together, you get the impression that you have on the lower right image. It's more convincing. It's just lines and shapes still, but you have an implication of depth. It's moving in that direction. Here's a completed artwork, an ink wash painting, very simple Chinese scroll painting that uses those techniques of just vertical placement and a little bit of overlap to create a very subtle, elegant implication of depth. All right, let's consider linear perspective. So you might want to take a minute just to pause this and just visually look through these illustrations that show the use of a vanishing point and the diminishment of scale of things moving towards that vanishing point to create a greater sense of depth. Linear perspective was invented in the Renaissance, and when it was put in combination with other forms of other compositional devices that could imply depth, all of this together ends up creating an illusion of spatial depth that is tremendously convincing to the eye. So here's an example of a Renaissance painting that uses linear perspective to a very convincing effect. The vanishing point in this painting is towards the center of the painting and in between the two figures, Plato and Aristotle in the middle. Let's go to a diagram that places this in black and white. It's a little easier to see that way. Here, okay, so you can see the vanishing point is between the two figures in the center, and all of the elements of the composition are lined up in such a way that they direct your eye towards that vanishing point. Here's one more technique that artists can use to create an impression of visual depth. What you're seeing here is atmospheric perspective. This doesn't have to do with the scale of things. This has to do with the color. So the compositional elements in this painting create an illusion of space themselves, But looking specifically at how color is used in this painting, look at the mountains in the center and look at the color of the mountains as they recede into the distance. You see the mountains that are closer to us have a greener cast to them and sharper detail. As the mountains get further away, the detail gets softer and hazier, and the color gets lighter and more blue. That gives the impression of atmosphere, and that makes the mountains that are further away look even more realistically distant. So that's using color to contribute to a realistic illusion of depth. So let's talk about contrast. Contrast means difference. Artworks that have more contrast can feel active and vivid. And if you don't have enough contrast, things can start to feel pretty dull. So this is a painting that has a very vivid, dynamic contrast in the sky. The colors in the sky are very saturated, and the orange red and the sort of turquoise blue are at opposite ends of the color spectrum, so that intense contrast makes the sky feel very, very dynamic and alive. There's less contrast in the hills of the painting. They seem much more subtle there, so your eyes keep going right back up to that sky again. I notice also off in the distance you can see atmospheric perspective in those mountains. Another visual element to consider is texture. We all know what texture is. Some texture in artwork is real or literal, something that you could actually touch with your hands. We can't actually touch a Van Gogh painting, but if you could, you would feel a very rough surface texture that we call impasto. In the painting on the right, you have this illusion of texture, this naturalistically painted detail where the surface of the chandelier looks smooth and shiny, and you feel like you could reach up and touch it.